Hi everyone! Welcome back to the first video of this year. I wanted to give a much needed update to my admittedly half-baked video on how I make my animatics by giving a more comprehensive guide, walking through how I operate my programs, as well as any tips and pointers that might be useful. So let's get into it. So before we get into actually making the animatic itself, you should probably go over what programs you're going to be using. So I'll start off by sharing what I use to make my own animatics. I use Clip Studio Paint for my drawings currently, as opposed to Metabang Paint, which I used to use as per the last video I made. As for editing, I've been using Sony Vegas Pro. I use the Wacom Intuos Pro and Huion Canvas 13 drawing tablets interchangeably, and all of this is on my poor gaming laptop. You don't have to use any of this stuff though to make a good animatic, and if you can work with free alternatives, more power to you. If you're specifically a mobile user, my recommendations as far as programs go are Ibis Paint or Flip-a-Clip for animation and CapCut for editing. If you're a PC user like me, Metabang and Fire Alpaca both work as solid free drawing programs, and as far as I remember, both of them had an onion mask feature, which is really good for animation. I've also heard Lightworks thrown around as a good free editing program, but that's the only one I don't have experience with, so I'm not sure if it's any good or not, but feel free to check it out anyways, because it might be useful to you. Once you've got all your material set, you're ready to begin. Making an animatic is generally going to come in 3 stages: your planning, drawing the actual animatic itself, and the editing. I'll be appropriately separating this guide into those 3 sections, but it's not uncommon to jump between any of these 3 stages throughout the entire process. Starting off with planning, this is the most crucial step. You want to have a solid plan going into your video, or else it can become messy very quickly. A good plan can keep you on schedule, as well as help form appropriate goals to chip away at your work bit by bit. You want to have a frame of reference as to your plan for your animatic, portraying how you'll draw each frame. As I mentioned in the old version of this video, I used to solely use written scripts for my animatics, but since then I've transitioned back to full-blown storyboards, sometimes with video mock-ups as well. Scripts have their own merits too, especially if you're trying to get an idea down quickly and don't have any art supplies on you at the moment, so it's all about what works best for you. What's important is having a reference that will help you properly visualize your final product, as you'll be going back to it both during the drawing and editing phases. You don't want to finish all your frames, then get to editing, and realize you don't remember how you wanted them to be timed. Planning doesn't just encompass the video itself though. Whether you just go for a script, a storyboard, or a mix of both, you'll likely find that your reference won't be very detailed in terms of visuals. This is completely normal and advisable, because you don't want to be spending all your time on the planning and never get to the drawing itself. For this reason, you'll want to have static visual references of the featured characters, the environment, and so forth. These don't have to be the most polished either, but they do have to be understandable and detailed enough to allow you to stay consistent while drawing. Once you have that done, you can begin your process of drawing. I will say right now that if you have an animation program that you can use for your animatics, I would highly recommend using it. However, if you're like me and intimidated by available animation features in your own art program, or have no time to learn, here's a quick guide for the coward's way out. As you can see here with my setup, I have for one of my older animatics, I have each frame divided into a different folder, and within these folders having different layers for line art, color, and sometimes other stuff. I have backgrounds and the foreground saved as different folders as well, as this makes it easier in the editing process. As far as everything else goes, you just draw as one normally does, treating each folder as you would a separate file for an illustration. This does tend to create pretty bulky raw files because of how many layers you have, and there have been points for longer animatics where I required 2 raw files in order to avoid lagging. Once you have all your frames drawn, you can pop them into your editing program, and here's where the real fun begins. You'll want to cross-reference with your storyboards, adding in frames as noted previously, and adjusting movement with the space you're given. Ideally, any editing program you use should have a multi-track feature and an ability to add keyframes. The multi-track feature allows you to add different images on different layers, similarly to how your art program may work, and this can help you by allowing you to essentially put your figure and backgrounds on different layers, which allows you to move your figure figures while keeping your backgrounds in the same position, and not having to worry about any white space where you move your figures, but you want to keep your background the same. Keyframes allow you to adjust different default states for your frames at a denoted time frame, say placing your image here on this keyframe and then moving it to the right on the next. Your program will do the work of the movement between these two frames, saving you the trouble of having to create extra images to show movement. This can also then enhance the illusion of animation and help you cut corners in how many individual frames you actually need. Keyframes can also be used in more subtle ways too. One trick I tend to use a lot is this kind of bounce effect between frames. Before we start off, let's show what this transition would look like without the use of keyframes. Boring, right? But we can fix that. I'll add a stationary keyframe near the end of the timeline, but not exactly at the end, in order to ensure it's static for most of the duration. And then add another keyframe at the end of the timeline, moving in whatever direction. Then I save that as a keyframe preset. I move to the timeline of my second frame, making the first keyframe the preset I saved earlier. This puts it in the same position as the previous frame would have ended at. I then overshoot, going back a little further than the default position. Then, in the third keyframe, I set it at the original position that the first frame would have started in. All these keyframes should be placed very close together for a quick, subtle movement. Altogether, you can see how the frame moves quickly in place, adding visual interest to what would otherwise be a mundane frame change. You can apply these principles in a manner of different ways, so have fun messing around with what you edit. With that, all that's left to do is fully form the animatic. Adjusting your images for timing may be hard, but if you're working with a song, as many beginner animators on YouTube tend to do, you actually have an added bonus in that regard. Take the time to study what song you're animating to, listening to each beat, how each instrument spikes along a given time span, and let yourself work with the music, timing your movement along it in order to create a more visually satisfying experience. And with that out of the way, all that's left to do is export your video and upload it to YouTube, TikTok, or whatever social media you may be using. I hope this is helpful, and feel free to shoot any other questions in the comments and I'll answer them the best I can. But please keep in mind, I'm not an expert. This isn't the ideal way to be making animatics. Seriously, use an animation program if you can, but this is how I tend to do it, and I hope it can be helpful for you guys who may be not ready to take that full next step just yet. And with that, thank you and see you next time!